I'm Jonah Bird.
And I'm Joseph, the Jazz Master Wyatt.
And welcome to Get a Load of Jazz here on 420 DAB Washington.
Today with us in the studio, we have Evan Cameron, music professor at Burgett University.
Ho, ho, ho. Thank you, Joe. I'm just happy to be on the show.
Evan, why don't you start us off with a little about Lou?
Louis Armstrong. In 1924, he married a little girl named Lil Hardin, a pianist, singer, composing.
Composing.
Just keep going. We have to keep going.
and arranger.
Park Ranger?
He grew up in dire poverty in New Orleans, Louisiana, when jazz was very young. One of the inventors of scat singing, he began to sing lyrics on most of his recordings, varying melodies or decorating with scat phrases in a gravel voice that was immediately identifiable. Many consider him the father of jazz. Moved from the typical blues songs, he incorporated his upbeat attitude and humor to help create a new style of music, especially evident in the use of scat.
Beyond fascinating. After the break, I'll be talking about the origins of the wonderful genre that we call jazz.
Armstrong actually played a huge role in jazz's beginning, both influencing the direction and popularity of jazz.
That's very interesting, Evan. We'll be right back.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them blue for me and you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Welcome back to Jazz on My Face on 420 DAB Washington.
Now, I'll be discussing the origins of jazz with you.
Enlighten us.
Enlighten I shall. Jazz originated in African American communities in the late 19th and early 20th century, with influences in African drumming and Afro-Caribbean music. As black people began to be freed from slavery, many of them found work in entertainment, adapting the music influences they had to European instruments.
How does jazz fit into history?
Well, the 20s were considered the jazz age, and for good reason. Fueled indirectly by prohibition, speakeasies continued to crop up in cellars everywhere, providing an endless supply of venues for aspiring musicians at which to perform.
And major music cities like New Orleans and St. Louis were filled with speakeasies, right?
Certainly. New Orleans, a town with more speakeasies than left shoes, became a hotbed for the development of jazz and some of its most talented musicians, Armstrong being one of them.
Yes! And the great migration of blacks from the south to north carried many of the talented musicians to the great northern cities like Chicago and New York. Jonah, why don't you elaborate a little on the different permutations of jazz?
Well, jazz was a very independent genre with improvisation and creativity at the forefront. This provided the opportunity for many different subgenres to crop up, namely bebop, big band, cool jazz, soul jazz, jizz jazz, smooth jazz, and swing, all of which persist today. Many of these subgenres also came from the many different scenarios in which jazz was played, from smooth jazz in balls and galas, to funeral jazz bands at funerals, to marching bands in the streets, to funk and speakeasies and parties. Some variation of jazz could be heard almost anywhere you went in the 1920s.
And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow.
Jazz was instrumental in the development of the Harlem Renaissance by breaking boundaries of the time in a sophisticated way.
You could thank Louis for that.
What boundaries might they be?
Well, my friends, after the Great War ended, it brought light to the domestic inequalities of our nation. It drew attention to the inequality in sex and race in our culture, and enlightened and congregated African Americans through art, literature, and music.
Music.
The art created helped unify the people and express their opinions in a sophisticated way.
Well, you know as well as I that jazz had a tremendous impact nationwide.
Yes, the Harlem Renaissance was not confined to its namesake New York neighborhood, but was a groundbreaking moment in African American culture that erupted in major cities across the country. Jazz is characterized as an improvisation style of music that allowed the artist to be free with their style and notes.
Honestly, the artistic freedom of jazz is what makes me love it so much.
Oh, yeah.
Author F. Scott Fitzgerald labeled the period from the end of the Great War to the Great Depression as the Jazz Era,
the Jazz
as
Age.
much for the cultural change it brought as the music defined it.
The music. Well, as much as I'd love to go on about jazz for another hour, they're giving me the signal from outside the booth.
Alright. What I'm trying to say is jazz is one of the most important African-American musical forms during the Harlem Renaissance.
the Harlem
And it's
Renaissance.
important for all of us to understand the influence of jazz on the culture of the 20s.
Oh, the 20s. Well, that's going to wrap up Jazz on My Face.
Evan Cameron, thanks for stopping by.
My genuine pleasure.
You're listening to 420 DAB Washington. Thank you for tuning in. Up next will be Calvin Broadus with The Blaze.